This is the second reading of the short story Battleground by Stephen King. Tiny foot soldiers, about an inch and a half tall, began to crawl out. Renshaw watched them, unblinking. His mind made no effort to cope with the real or unreal aspect of what he was seeing, only with the possible consequences for his survival. The soldiers were wearing minuscule army fatigues, helmets, and field packs. Tiny carbines were slung across their shoulders. Two of them looked briefly across the room at Renshaw. Their eyes, no bigger than pencil points, glittered. 5, 10, 12, then all 20. One of them was gesturing, ordering the others. They lined themselves up along the crack that the fall had produced and began to push. The crack began to widen. Renshaw picked up one of the large pillows off the couch and began to walk towards them. The commanding officer turned and gestured. The others whirled, unslung their carbines, and there were tiny, almost delicate popping sounds. And Renshaw felt suddenly as if he were being stung by bees. He threw the pillow. It struck them, knocking them sprawling, then hit the box. It knocked wide open. Insect-like, with a faint, high whirling noise like chiggers, a cloud of miniature helicopters, painted jungle green, rose out of the box. Tiny sounds reached Renshaw's ears, and he saw pinprick-sized muzzle flashes coming from the opening of the chopper doors. Needles pricked his belly, his right arm, and the side of his neck. He clawed out and got one. Sudden pain in his fingers, blood welling. The whirlwind blades had chopped them to the bone in diagonal scarlet hash marks. The others whirled out of range, circling him like horseflies, the stricken chopper tumbling to the rug, laying still. Suddenly, excruciating pain from his foot made him cry out. One of the foot soldiers was standing on his shoe and bayoneting his ankle. The tiny face looked up, panting and grinning. Renshaw kicked at it, and the tiny body flew across the room to splatter on the wall. It did not leave blood, but a vivid purple smear. There was a tiny coughing explosion, and blinding agony ripped his thigh. One of the bazooka men had come out of the footlocker. A small curl of smoke rose lazily from his weapon. Renshaw looked down at his leg and saw a blackened, smoking hole in his pants the size of a quarter. The flesh beneath it was charred. "That little bastard shot me." He turned and ran into the hall, then into his bedroom. One of the helicopters buzzed past his cheek, blades whirling busily. The small stutter of a BAR, and then it darted away. The gun beneath his pillow was a .44 Magnum, big enough to put a hole the size of two fists through anything it hit. Renshaw turned, holding the weapon in his hands. He realized coolly that he would be shooting a moving target not much bigger than a flying light bulb. Two of the coppers whirled in. Sitting on the bed, Renshaw fired once. One of the helicopters exploded into nothingness. "That's two," he thought. He drew a bead on the second, squeezed the trigger. It jiggled. Gosh darn it, it jiggled. The helicopter swooped at him in a sudden deadly arc, fore and aft overhead propellers whirling with a blinding speed. Renshaw caught a glimpse of one of the bar men crouched at the open bay door, firing his weapon in a short, deadly burst. Then he threw himself to the floor and rolled. My eyes! That bastard was going for my eyes! He came up on his back at the far wall, the gun held at chest level, but the helicopter was retreating. It seemed to pause for a moment and dip in recognition of Renshaw's superior firepower. Then it was gone, back towards the living room. Renshaw got up, winced as his weight came down on the wounded leg. It was bleeding freely now, and why not? He thought grimly. It was not everybody who gets hit point blank with the bazooka shell and lives to tell about it. So Kim was his number one idea girl, was she? She was all that and a bit more. He shook a pillowcase free of the tick and ripped it into the bandage for his leg. Then he took his shaving mirror from the bureau and went to the hallway door. Kneeling, he shoved it out onto the carpet at an angle and peered in. They were biovacking by the footlocker. Damned if they weren't. Miniature soldiers ran hither and thither, setting up tents. Jeeps 2 inches high raced about importantly. A medic was working over the soldier Renshaw had kicked. The remaining 8 helicopters flew in a protective swarm overhead at coffee table level. Suddenly they became aware of the mirror, and 3 of the foot soldiers dropped to one knee and began firing. Seconds later, the mirror shattered in 4 places. Okay then. Renshaw went back to the bureau and got a heavy mahogany odds and ends box Linda had left him for Christmas. He hefted it once, nodded, and went to the doorway and lunged through. He wound up and fired like a pitcher throwing a fastball. The box described a swift and true vector and smashed the little men like 9 pins. One of the jeeps rolled over twice. Renshaw advanced towards the door of the living room, sighted on one of the sprawling soldiers, and gave it to him. Several of the others had recovered. Some were kneeling and firing formally. Others had taken cover. Still others had retreated back into the footlocker. The bee stings began to pepper his legs and torso, but none reached higher than his rib cage. Perhaps the range was too great. It didn't matter. He had no intention of being turned away. This was it. He missed with his next shot, so they were so gosh darn small. But the following one sent another soldier into the broken sprawl. The helicopters were buzzing towards him ferociously. Now the tiny bullets began to splat into his face, above and below his eyes. He destroyed the lead helicopter and then the second. Jagged streaks of pain slivered his vision. The remaining 6 helicopters split into 2 retreating wings. His face was wet with blood and he swiped at it with his forearm. He was ready to start firing again when he paused. The soldiers who retreated inside the footlocker were trundling something out. Something that looked like There was a blinding sizzle of yellow fire, and a sudden gust of wood and plaster exploded from the wall to his left. A rocket launcher! He squeezed off one shot at it, missed, wheeled and ran for the bathroom at the far end of the corridor. He slammed the door and locked it. In the bathroom mirror, an Indian was staring back at him with dazed and haunted eyes. A battle-crazed Indian with thin streamers of red paint drawn from the holes no bigger than grains of pepper. A ragged flap of skin dangled from one cheek. There was a gouged furrow in his neck. "I'm losing!" He ran a shaking hand through his hair. The front door was cut off. So was the phone and the kitchen extension. they had a gosh darn rocket launcher and a direct hit would tear his head off. Damn it, that wasn't even listed on the box. He started to draw in a long breath and let it out in a sudden grunt as a fist-sized section of the door blew in with charred bursts of wood. Tiny flames glowed briefly around the ragged edges of the hole, and he saw the brilliant flash as they launched another round. More wood blew inward, scattered burning slivers onto the bathroom rug. He stamped them out, and two of the helos buzzed angrily through the hole. Minuscule BAR slugs stitched his chest. With a whining groan of rage, he smacked one out of the air barehanded, sustaining a picket fence of deep slashes across his palm. In sudden, desperate invention, he slung a heavy bath towel over the other. It fell, writhing, to the floor, and he stomped the life out of it. His breath was coming in hoarse whoops. Blood ran into one eye, hot and stinging, and he wiped it away. There, gosh darn it, there. That'll make them think. Indeed, it did seem to make them think. There was no more movement for a full 15 minutes. Renshaw sat on the side of the tub, thinking feverishly. There had to be a way out of this blind alley. There had to be. If there was only a way to flank them. He suddenly turned and looked at the small window over the tub. There was a way. Of course there was a way. His eyes dropped to the can of lighter fluid on the top of the medicine cabinet. He was reaching for it when the rustling noise came. He whirled, bringing up the magnum, but it was only a tiny scrap of paper shoved under the crack of the door. The crack, Renshaw noted grimly, was too narrow for even one of them to get through. There was one tiny word written on the paper: surrender. Renshaw smiled grimly and put the lighter fluid in his breast pocket. There was a chewed stub of pencil beside it. He scrawled one word on the paper and shoved it back under the door. The word was nuts. There was a sudden blinding barrage of rocket shells, and Renshaw backed away. They arced through the hole in the door and detonated against the pale blue tiles above the towel rack, turning the elegant wall into a pocket lunar landscape. Renshaw threw his hand over his eyes as hot plaster flew in a hot rain of shrapnel. Burning holes ripped through his shirt, and his back was peppered. When the barrage stopped, Renshaw moved. He climbed on top of the tub and slid the window open. Cold stars looked in at him. It was a narrow window, and a narrow ledge beyond that. But there was no time to think about that. He boosted himself through, and the cold air slapped his lacerated face and neck like an open hand. He was leaning over the balance point of his hands, staring straight down. 40 stories down. From this height, the street looked no wider than a child's train track. The bright winking lights of the city glittered madly below him like thrown jewels. With the deceptive ease of a trained gymnast, Renshaw brought his knees up to rest on the lower edge of the window. If one of those wasp-sized copters flew through that hole, one shot in the butt would send him straight down, screaming all the way. But none did. He twisted, thrust one leg out, and one hand grabbed the overhand gargoyle that was placed above him, and it held. A moment later, he was standing on the ledge outside the window, deliberately not thinking of the horrifying drop below his heels, not thinking of what would happen if one of the helicopters buzzed after him. Renshaw grabbed towards the corner of the building. 15 feet. 10. There, he had it. He paused, his chest pressed against the walls, hands splayed out on the rough surface. He could feel the lighter fluid in his breast pocket and the reassuring weight of the magnum jammed in his waistband. Now to get around the gosh darn corner. Gently, he eased one foot around and slid his weight onto it. Now the right angle was pressed razor-like into his chest and gut. There was a smear of bird guano in front of his eyes on the rough stone. Geez, he thought crazily. I didn't know they could fly this high. His left foot slipped. For a weird, timeless moment, he tottered over the brink, right arm back watering madly for balance. And then he was clutching the two sides of the building in a lover's embrace, face pressed against the hard corner, breath shuddering in and out of his lungs. A bit at a time, and he slid his other foot around. 30 feet away, his own living room terrace jutted out. He made his way down to it, breath sliding in and out of his lungs with shallow force. Twice he was forced to stop as sharp gusts of winds tried to pick him off the ledge. Then he was there, gripping the iron railings. He hoisted himself over noiselessly. He had left the curtains half drawn across the sliding glass partition, and now he peered in cautiously. They were just the way he wanted them, looking away. 4 soldiers and 1 helicopter had been left to guard the footlocker. The rest would be outside the bathroom door with the rocket launcher. Okay. In through the opening like gangbusters. Wipe out the ones by the footlocker, then out to the door. Then a quick taxi to the airport, off to Miami to find Morris's #1 idea girl. He thought he might just burn her face off with a flamethrower. That would be poetic justice. He took off his shirt, ripped a long strip from one sleeve. He dropped the rest to flutter limply by his feet and bit off the plastic spout of the can of lighter fluid. He stuffed one end of the rag inside, withdrew it, and stuffed the other end so only 6-inch strip of saturated cotton hung free. He got out his lighter, took a deep breath, and thumbed the wheel. He tipped it to the cloth, and as it sprang alight, he rammed open the glass partition and plunged through. The helicopter reacted instantly, kamikaze diving him as if he charged across the rug, dripping tiny splatters of liquid fire. Renshaw straight-armed it, hardly noticing the jolt of pain that ran up his arm as the turning blades chopped his flesh open. The tiny foot soldier scattered into the footlocker. After that, it all happened fairly rapidly. Renshaw threw the lighter fluid. The can caught, mushrooming into the licking fireball, and the next instant he was reversing, running for the door. He never knew what hit him. It was like the thud of a steel safe would make when dropped from a respectable height. Only this thud ran through the entire high-rise apartment building, thrumming its steel frame like a tuning fork. The penthouse door blew off its hinges and scattered against the far wall. A couple who had been walking hand in hand looked up in time to see a very large white flash, as though hundreds of flashing guns had gone off at once. Somebody blew a fuse, the man said. I guess. What's that? The girl asked. Something was fluttering lazily down towards them. He caught it in one outstretched hand. Geez, some guy's shirt, all full of little holes. Bloody, too. I don't like it, she said nervously. Call a cab, huh, Ralph? We'll have to talk to the cops if something happens up there, and I ain't supposed to be out with you. Yeah, sure. He looked around, saw a taxi, and whistled. Its brake lights flared, and they ran across to get it. Behind them, unseen, a tiny scrap of paper floated down and landed near the remain of John Renshaw's shirt. Spiky backhand script read, "Hey kids, special in this Vietnam footlocker. For a limited time only."